All right, let's see how we can take that ugly form from the previous lesson and turn it into a beautiful form like this. Here in our style sheet, first we define a rule for our body element and set the font family to the system font stack. So we type -Apple and press enter. Now, if you're not using VS Code and you don't get this auto completion in your editor, just Google CSS system font stack. There are plenty of websites where you can find this long sequence of fonts. Okay. I'm also going to set line height to 1.5, so our lines are more readable. Now with a simple change, our form already looks a little bit better. Next, I want to take this input field and put it right below its label. That is very easy. Back to our style sheet, we define a rule for our labels and set the display to block. Because labels are inline elements, when we convert them to block level elements, they take up the entire width of the page, so the input field appears on a new line. Now there is a problem here. You're violating the law of proximity. Remember this law? We humans perceive objects that are close to each other as connected. Now currently the vertical space between all these labels and input fields is exactly the same. So it's really hard to distinguish a label and its associated field. Some people cannot tell what is the label for the first field. Is it name or email? So we want to add a vertical space between these input groups. Now back to our markup. In the previous lesson, we grouped each label and its associated input field inside a div. Now we can give this div a class like form-group. That's a very common class name for this purpose. Now back to our style sheet. We define a rule and say an element with the class of form group should have a bottom margin of, let's say, 1 rem. That's better. All right, now let's define some styles for our text fields. So back to our style sheet, I'm going to define a new rule for our inputs. And by the way, if you're wondering how I'm ordering these rules, I would prefer, well, a lot of people prefer to have more generic rules on the top and more specialized rules on the bottom. So up here we have body, then we have label, input. These are general rules for HTML elements. But as we get down here, our rules are getting more specific. Okay. So for this input, I'm going to set the border to 1 pixel, solid, CCC, which is a very light gray, and also give it a border radius of 5 pixels. So here's what we get. If we type something here, you can see that our text is so close to the edges of our input field. How can we solve this problem? Using the padding property. So here we set padding to, let's say 0.5 rems for vertical padding and 0.7 rems for horizontal padding. And of course, these numbers are arbitrary. There's no right or wrong. You can play with these values to get the look that you prefer. All right, that looks much better. Now there is a problem in our implementation. As you will see later in this section, we have different types of input fields. So far, we have only used single line text fields and email fields, but using the input element, we can also render a checkbox or a radio button. So back to our style sheet, we don't want to blindly apply this rule for all kinds of input fields. We want to apply these only to text fields. So this is where we can use an attribute selector. So after input, we type square brackets and type an attribute, in this case type, we set it to text. So if you have an input field with this attribute, these styles will be applied. Now take a look. So our first input field has the styles, but the second one doesn't because the type of this input field is email. So here we need to add a second selector and set the type to email. And that solves the problem. Good. Now let's work on the focus state. So back to our style sheet, we're going to define another rule for inputs with the type of text in the state of focus. So this is a pseudo class selector we talked about earlier. In this state, I'm going to change the border color to 7DB0FB. Now there's nothing special about this. Before recording this lesson, I was playing with some numbers and this is what I came up with. So let's take a look. We don't see the effect. We still see that dark blue border. This is the border that Chrome and many other browsers apply by default. We can get rid of that by setting outline to 0. Now we see the border that we defined. But look, this beautiful border doesn't appear here because this is an email field. So here we need to add another selector for selecting email fields. Now the problem is gone. Good. Now I would like to add a box shadow around this border so it's more visible. So back to our style sheet, we can set box shadow to, I'm going to use 0 and 0 for horizontal and vertical offset, 0 for blurring, 4 pixels for spreading the shadow, and for the color, I'm going to use RGBA 24, 117, 255, and 0.25 for transparency. Again, nothing special about these values. I just came up with these values before recording this lesson. So here's what we get, much nicer. Now, if you notice, when an input field gets focused, the transition is very quick. But the transitions in the real world are not like that. When we throw a ball, it doesn't magically disappear from one point and appear in another point. We always see a smooth transition. How can we do that in CSS? Using the transition property. So back to the first rule for our input fields in the normal state. Here we're going to set transition to. Now, what properties are we changing in the focus state? We're changing border color, outline, and box shadow. I want to apply a transition for border color and box shadow. So I want to say border color should change in 0.15 seconds and box shadow should also change in 0.15 seconds. Now look at the impact of this property. We get this beautiful, smooth transition. Now let's work on our buttons. So back to our style sheet, let's define a new rule for button elements. Here I'm going to set the background color to 0D, 6E, FD. With that, here's what we get. Now, generally speaking, white text always looks better on blue background. It's more readable. So let's set the color to 3Fs, which represents white. That looks better. Now we also have this ugly border around the button. This is the default style that almost all browsers apply. So we can get rid of that by setting border to 0. That's better. Now currently our text is so close to the edges of the button. To solve this problem, we can give our button a padding of 0.5 rems and 0.7 rems. That's better. Now finally, let's apply a border radius so we get round corners. So let's say border radius of 5 pixels. That's better. Now if we click on this button, we can see that blue border, that outline that Chrome adds by default. We can get rid of that by setting outline to 0. And we can apply this property for the button in the normal state or in the focus state. It works either way. So now when I click, nothing happens. But of course, when we click on this button, we want to change the background color. We want to make it darker so it looks like a real button. Now, one last thing. Currently, our input fields are so close to the edges of the page. To solve that, we can apply a padding to the body element. So padding of 1 rem. That's better. We could also apply the padding to the form element. That's another approach. So this is how we can style forms. But as you will see in this section, we have several types of input fields. So defining all these styles for various input fields can sometimes be time consuming. So this is where a lot of people use CSS frameworks. We'll talk about that next.